Hello, fellow cynics. Just wanted to come in here at the start of the episode and give you a little content warning. Our discussion gets a little heavy in this episode, so if you are listening with children or if you are sensitive to discussion of sexual assault, maybe skip this one and join us for episode 4 in 2 weeks.
Well, welcome everybody to the third episode of the Happy Cynics. We're going to delve into something here that, believe it or not, somebody out there probably thinks that we're being put up to this by somebody, because we're going to be talking about conspiracies. And,
Wait, you didn't get your? Did you not get your paycheck from George Soros yet?
No, not yet.
They keep telling me it's in the mail, but I don't know.
As long as I keep getting free shipping through Amazon, I feel like I'm covered. So the Illuminati's taking care of me somehow. Conspiracies. Why do we embrace them? Well, first, let's just like a little background here. Embracing conspiracies is nothing new. It's just a part. You do a lot of reading of literature. And of course, on the psychological side, they talk a lot about how our brains are hardwired to find patterns. Okay. So a lot of conspiracy belief just starts with this. It's just like confirmation bias. It starts with wanting to find patterns in things. Now, you did some reading in sociology, right, Isaac?
Yeah, talking about some of the impetus to turn that pattern recognition stuff that you see in psychology into more sinister, Salem witch trials sort of things.
Right. Because that's kind of the backdrop assumption with the psychological studies of conspiracies. Or believing in conspiracies. Our brains are hardwired to find patterns, and this generally serves us well. And there are conspiracies, and there have always been belief in conspiracies, but sometimes factors kind of start kicking in where people get carried away and perhaps start seeing patterns where there's really not a pattern there, or at least it's highly unlikely that the pattern that they're looking for is not there. So would you say, Isaac, that the sociology, does it have to do with, say, people that are trying to find these patterns and then they just kind of seek each other out for confirmation, or what's going on there?
Well, so, excuse me. Societies are always in the process of meaning making, trying to find what makes them as a group cohesive and what makes those outside of their group not part of their group. But when a previously thriving society experiences a moment of downturn or a moment of decay in that society, a lot of those meaning-making exercises, that pattern recognition, turns towards an impetus towards like a sacrificial kind of slant.
What do you mean sacrificial?
So when a group experiences,
they put somebody on the altar and pull out
precisely.
The dagger? Okay,
yeah, precisely.
Sociologically. Scapegoat stuff?
Well, exactly. So it's the scapegoat mechanism at play in a lot of conspiracy theories. So most conspiracy theories are not internally cohesive. But to a conspiracy theorist, the structure and actual claims of a conspiracy theory don't matter nearly as much as the identification of an enemy.
Right.
So the function of a conspiracy theory in a society in decline is to give an explanation for why that society is suddenly in decline. So like I said earlier, in Salem, there were genuinely things happening in that society, like disease and famine and, whatever was the situation that seemed random. And, in the worldview of the time, well, that has to be the work of the devil or some relation to sin, because the society itself couldn't possibly deserve judgment.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have these selection of these women as witches,
right?
Partially because they seemed not to be affected by whatever happened to be plaguing society at the time.
Right. So they must be behind it.
Exactly. So then by scapegoating them, they become eligible non-members of the community. They were previously just part of the community. By creating them as a scapegoat, they become non-members and therefore acceptable for sacrifice.
Yes. A lot of people don't realize, but see, this is all connected. And so, say, conspiracy thinking's even behind the practice of cannibalism in a number of tribes around the world. The old practice of cannibalism had to do with not just, oh, gee, Uncle Joe's thighs look pretty juicy. I wonder what he would taste like over a spit. But it was whatever happened bad that year, there had to be somebody who was the cause of this, like angering the gods. And so the gods are punishing us for somebody's sin. So we'll find some way of determining who's responsible. And then to appease the gods, you kill them, you roast them, you slather them with barbecue sauce or whatever. And then that supposedly is going to make, you're making the feast for the god to devour the evil person too. And then God's happy. And then perhaps the famine or the drought or disease or whatever will go away. And it's not completely separated from what goes on today when people is like, I don't like what's happening here. I don't like what's happening here. But instead of acknowledging that society itself may be changing in the way that it thinks about things, oh no, we got to have somebody to blame. Okay. I'm going to interject a little story here. And she can't object because she passed away a couple of years ago. When I went away to seminary, okay, I'm 5 years older than my younger brother. Well, by the time I was in seminary, because I worked for a couple of years before I went from between my bachelor's degree and then my master's degree. But by the time I was finishing with seminary, my brother was about your age then, okay? And his views started to change on some things. Well, then my mother scapegoated me and told me that you're the reason he doesn't think this way anymore because you go into that seminary and they're feeling like, and then she scapegoated the seminary for me thinking differently. You went to that liberal seminary, which was Asbury, ha ha ha, and they've turned, those Methodists have turned you into liberal, and you're trying to turn your brother into a liberal. And she just didn't want to acknowledge that, maybe things aren't as simple as what I would like to believe. Now, fortunately, Mom and I, things worked out better later on, and we were able to patch and build our relationship. But I went through that where she scapegoated me for ruining my brother. And my brother and I don't agree on a lot of things today. But we still love and respect one another. But see, that's kind of the impulse. I mean, and that's where conspiracy theory, buying into conspiracy theories starts to get really dangerous. I mean, there's one thing to be alert and say, hey, things may not be always as they appear on the face of things, prima facie. Okay. There may be something more here than meets the eye. That's one side which we have to be diligent. You can't just be naive and just assume, oh, everybody means well. Everybody just wants the best. But on the other hand, you can't go to the other extreme and just anything that you don't like or anything that bad happens. Oh, there must be somebody's behind it. And it must be somebody's fault.
Right. Yeah. And I think there's a danger here of saying that conspiracies never happen. Well, that's straight up not true.
Right.
They do happen quite frequently. I don't know if you're familiar with the Tuskegee experiments.
Yes, somewhat. I was more into the JFK stuff, but go ahead.
So the Tuskegee experiments were a real conspiracy against a group of black men who had contracted syphilis. And they enrolled in a experimental treatment for syphilis in I think it was the 40s. However, the conspiracy decided not to give them the treatment and instead see how the disease played out long term. Even after, in 1945, the cure for syphilis was found, these men were not given that cure even though they believed they had. So they went on and lived their life thinking that, their families were affected by this. There are all these repercussions of it, and they were not told what was really going on until the late 70s. Well, that's a real conspiracy that
Yes.
However, that for me, as horrible as that is, it's not a conspiracy theory, and the litmus test for that for me is there's no clear out group defined. Right? Those black men who had contracted syphilis were not theorizing this in order to scapegoat someone. They weren't seeking revenge or some explanation for why their community was in decline. They did seek reparations for what had happened through the legal system. So there's a difference there between a conspiracy and conspiracy theory, and an easy way to tell is, well, is it this one terrible thing happened because this one group of medical experimenters decided to do this thing, but it's not a widespread cultural wide phenomena?
Mm-hmm.
Or is it, all the Jews are controlling our money?
Yeah.
Those are pretty significant differences.
All right. So, okay, let's say that. Okay, here, let's take that one as an example. I mean, because this is really what was behind a lot of Nazi Germany. Now, it would be naive to say that you could not find one single Jewish businessman who wasn't greedy or something. I'm sure you could find greedy people in every people group. Okay. It's just like the other stereotypes. You come across somebody that has a certain appearance and they commit a crime or whatever, and then you just assume that everybody that fits that description, it's just an oversimplification. And that's what the problem, say, with conspiracy theories is they just get blown way out of proportion. So like here in the news, I mean, they've discovered, and you have these people been just sentenced for their involvement in this sex ring with what was his name? Michael Cohen, the guy committed suicide then in prison.
Jeffrey Epstein.
Oh, yeah. Not Michael Cohen. Jeffrey Epstein. My mistake. Yeah, Jeffrey Epstein. That whole case. And that lady that was involved in it, and she just got sentenced to I don't know how many years. But, and then just yesterday, member of the Manson family, Leslie Van Houten, was left out on parole. But it would be like taking, go back to the Manson family, okay? There was a group of people that were involved in some goofy stuff and committed murders. And so there was something real there to uncover. But just because of that, like a conspiracy theory would be that, oh, these people all met in San Francisco. So everybody that was at the Love-In in San Francisco or whatever, I don't know if any of the Manson people were up there. I imagine probably some of them were. But it would be like assuming that, oh, well, all these hippie groups must be going to go out and commit murder, and just kind of blow the whole thing out of proportion. I mean, there's a real danger, but you've got to put it into proper perspective and quit allowing our fears and imaginations to just run wild. And the same thing with like this sex ring thing. There are people out there doing some bad things, but that doesn't mean that it's around every corner, or everybody that belongs to a certain political party, or everybody that watches a certain news channel or whatever. Everybody fits into this nice little neat box. And it just seems to me, Isaac, that a lot of the problems that are being caused is because people don't want to have to think through the complexity of some of the social ills that are going on in society.
Yeah, so one of the things you've brought up, the sex ring conspiracy theories, Pizzagate comes to mind, or Alex Jones' documentary that he released, I'm probably 15 years ago now, where he went to whatever that camp is in California that all the rich people go to, and
yes,
put on a play and burn an effigy, and he had footage of them supposedly performing child sacrifices and stuff like that. Those types of conspiracy theories are called black ritual conspiracy theories. That there's this shadowy cabal of people who meet at night in order to perform human sacrifices. That goes back centuries, that idea. And was originally leveled at the Jews. When the idea was the community of Jews for Passover were meeting at night in the woods to sacrifice Christian babies and add their blood to the Passover feast.
Yeah, and that
none of it's true, but
that was also what early Christians were accused of in the Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a tale as old as time. So when you hear that nowadays, like I know a lot of the QAnon conspiracy theorists are all about, saving our children from,
all these
sex
groomers.
Trafficking and
right.
all sorts of stuff like that. While that might be a noble cause, if it was real, that comes with centuries of baggage of that exact claim being leveled at whatever group is the new target.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And one of the things you got to look out for from the sociological side is who's benefiting from peddling these theories.
Right.
So we talked about Alex Jones. Alex Jones has made a lot of money off of selling conspiracy theories on InfoWars.
Yes.
But in 2016, with Donald Trump as the presidential candidate for the Republican Party, who's good friends with Alex Jones, suddenly the conspiracy market became a lot more lucrative because it was a way into the mainstream power struggle.
Mm-hmm.
So we saw kind of an explosion of conspiracy theories following Donald Trump's election because Donald Trump himself is a conspiracy theorist.
Right. Yes. Well, okay, yes. And Donald Trump is somebody who represents a mindset that anything that bad happens to me, somebody must have it in for me. It's like the kid that gets cut from the basketball team. He doesn't want to think that, maybe I didn't do very well at the tryout. It's like, oh, somebody's got it in for me. I'm sorry, but that's what people can't see, that a lot of people ignore the fact that people like Trump who think everything's a conspiracy. Why is that? Because he thinks he's entitled to success in everything he does. And so if he fails at something, it must be somebody else's fault. Somebody else has got it in for me. And those things just serve him. It's very self-serving. And there's a difference between that kind of a conspiracy person and the person who's just like the Chicken Little, I would call him the Chicken Little conspiracy theorist, who just runs around telling everybody the sky's falling. Oh my golly, I wish I had $1 for everybody throughout Christian history who's tried to predict the coming of the Antichrist.
You'd be quite rich.
Oh my goodness. And that's what a lot of people don't realize. And, they're watching all these people that supposedly, John Hagee and Jack Van Ippy and some of these others who are out there, like, they're going to discern this and that and the other. They're not even aware of like the Hebrew scriptures and the context of what those texts are actually about. And all they're doing is just stirring up all these folks. I remember my grandmother on my mother's side, before she passed away, she would get herself all worked up by listening. She would listen to these late night doomsday evangelists on the radio who were predicting that the Antichrist is out there and the New World Order is going to take over and everything. And then I would have to talk her down off the ledge, so to speak. And Grandma, why do you listen to these people? I've told you before that they don't know half of what they're talking about, and they're just guessing. Okay, they're just guessing. It's not based on anything concrete or substantial. I mean, even the way they're trying to interpret the text and all that, it's just so open-ended. Well, she was like, oh, I understand that, but it's just kind of like, how they used to hook people on soap operas, or like running drama shows, like, you got the cliffhanger ending and you got to find out. So even though people may be a little skeptical, they still want to find out. They're just too curious. It's like, curiosity killed the cat. And oh my golly, it's mind-boggling.
Yeah, it's an interesting connection between the Antichrist, the devil, and these conspiracy theories. Our like modern depiction of the devil, of big pointy horns, cloven hooves, and then if you look at medieval art of the devil, he often has quite a large hooked nose.
Right.
There's not coincidentally a connection there to anti-Semitic conspiracy theories in how the devil's portrayed in our society. Yeah.
It's well, and the red skin. Yeah. Of course, I guess it's kind of hard to live in fire without your skin getting red. Anyhow, but so, let me circle back around now. So in some of these articles I was reading, okay, so here's the thing. We know that there are conspiracies out there. We know there are bad things that happen, and we know that we should not be, just a bunch of lemmings and just assume that there's nothing bad going on. But the question is, when do we have to put on the brakes and say, okay, wait a minute, let's not get carried away here? So what's the difference between the person, and I'll be honest with you. I mean, I've thought about and often speculate about the whole JFK assassination, because there were so many people that wanted that guy dead that had the wherewithal to pull it off. I don't know which conspiracy is probably the correct one, but it's just hard for me to believe it was only just Lee Harvey Oswald, a random guy, and then he was just the only. Everybody else loved JFK, and then Lee Harvey Oswald wasn't connected to anybody. I mean, especially whenever Jack Ruby stepped out and then shot Oswald before they could go to trial, and that's what made the whole thing look weird. I remember as a kid being fascinated by that. In fact, my parents they didn't buy too many books, but one book they had, because they were big JFK supporters, even though they've been staunch Republicans after Carter. But they had a book called The Torch is Passed, and it was all about the JFK presidency, assassination, and then and I remember looking at the pictures and everything, and Jack, and with him getting killed by Jack Ruby, that just made the whole thing look really shady. Okay, so now the people say, just one guy. Okay, so Jack Ruby loved JFK that much that he was willing to rot in jail to shoot Oswald instead of letting Oswald go to trial? I mean, you could at least see maybe somebody that loved JFK waiting, and then if, say, Oswald got let go on a technicality or something like that, that they might get angry and then go out and shoot him. Okay, like the assassination of John Lennon. I've never heard too much about a conspiracy about that. It was probably, just that one crackpot, and that was it. But the thing is, there are conspiracies, and I'm not saying that, don't anybody hear me saying that, you should never believe that there's any kind of conspiracy, because there are people that do things behind closed doors, and there are people that make agreements and things like that. But on the other hand, some people are just afraid that it's like they see the devil in every closet. It's like they're afraid to look under the bed. The boogeyman's always there to get them or whatever. And so that's what I want to kind of shift to. So let me talk about these articles I read, and you just jump in anywhere you want to. And if you haven't jumped in by the time I get done with these articles, then I want to shift to the stuff that you read, and you can kind of give your commentary on it. But feel free to interject here unless you want to go with something right now.
Yeah, just touching on the whole JFK assassination. The same time period, Martin Luther King Jr., there was a long-held conspiracy that Martin King Jr. was being harassed by the FBI in the years and months up to his death.
Yeah, I've read that too.
A group of civil rights activists broke into an FBI office in Pennsylvania and found the letter that Martin Luther King Jr. received in the FBI office. So Martin Luther King Jr. received a letter of harassment, basically telling him to commit suicide. And they found the exact letter in this FBI office in Philadelphia. Then later, as White House documents were becoming declassified, they found it in White House documents, the exact same word for word letter. So now I don't know if you're familiar with Bo Burnham's Inside special.
No.
He put it out during quarantine. It's on Netflix. Go watch it. It's very funny.
Okay. I remember Bart Sugarman's Midnight Special, but that was a different. That was a late night. There was a weekend rock concerts on TV. Go ahead.
So one of the lyrics in one of the songs from Inside is the FBI killed Martin Luther King. I mean, that's a conspiracy theory still kicking around, and you know, I'm rather inclined to believe that maybe they did.
Well, yeah. So, that's hard to believe that. Well, okay. So you have this choice. It's either so with these assassinations, okay, it was either that some of these folks that didn't like them, like organizations or people, groups of people, and they put the assassin up to it or supported them or groomed them to do it. Or the other person acted on his own, and they were all guys that did these assassinations. That's why I'm saying his. He did it on his own, and these other groups just got lucky, and it's like, wow, somebody took care of this for us. But there were people who wanted him dead. And the thing with the JFK assassination, I think that also kind of builds into it is the assassination of his brother a few years later. And I mean, I got into these documentaries on organized crime families and the whole battle between, like from Chicago and then out eastward between, say, like the Italian groups and the Irish groups. Like Chicago, the whole Capone thing was this territorial battle between the Irish groups in the north and the Italian groups in the south, and which led to the St. Valentine's Day massacre and other things. And supposedly, I mean, one of these documentaries kind of pushed the conspiracy theory that that basically Robert F. Kennedy, when it was a district, like a U.S. district attorney, and he was going after the Italian organized families, but not doing anything against the Irish organized groups. And whenever JFK ran for president, they needed Chicago to go for him so he could win the election because it was such a toss-up between him and Nixon. And supposedly, the leaders of the Italian mob met with their father, Joe Kennedy, and made a deal that if they would get Bobby Kennedy off their backs, they would get the unions to vote for JFK. That was that conspiracy that documentary or supposed documentary was trying to push. And there could be something to that. And the fact was, JFK won because he did get the Chicago vote. That gave the Illinois electoral votes to him, and he edged out Nixon from winning Illinois. And but then instead of Robert Kennedy backing down, JFK made him attorney general, and then he doubled or tripled his efforts in going after the Italian groups all over the country. And then, of course, 2 years later, JFK ends up with a bullet in his head. So I don't know. I mean, here's the thing. I don't really have a problem with people speculating about a particular event, okay, that happened or, and why it happened, and there may have been other people behind it. Where it starts to get corrosive is when people start doubting the basic fabric of society. You understand what I'm saying? It's one thing to say, I think there's probably a group of people out there that would like to see certain people dead. There probably are. But let's not get carried away and assume that this is widespread. It's okay. So let me pull another example here. We're not even getting to the articles yet, but here's another example. So just like the the Patriot Act after 9/11,
right?
I know you were a little kid, but then we okayed with the government, monitoring email and text messages and things like that. I mean, we look and say, oh, look, there's my home on Google Earth, or Google Maps, and you can look right down and see the satellite shot of your house. And it's like, oh, isn't that great? Well, we know there's satellites out there. I mean, it's not that difficult to track somebody anymore. The old days of Bonnie and Clyde and you're going to hide out somewhere. That just would almost be impossible to pull off unless you were some kind of a tech whiz to somehow counteract the technology. But, I guess until we come up with Romulan cloak technology or something where you can make yourself invisible, I don't see how that would be possible now. But here's the thing. Yeah, if the government wants to listen in on my phone calls, I'm sure they can do it. But here's the thing, folks. Joe Citizen out there, do you think really that people that work for the government have nothing better to do than to watch you go to Walmart and pick up your weekly groceries or something? Do you think they're really, do you think they're really interested in that? If you could monitor, let's put it this way. if I had the ability to monitor everybody's phone calls in the neighborhood, well, how much would I do it? I mean, what would you even need to do it? All you have to do is get on social media, and most people are blabbing everything that they know anyway. It's like you just can't live in this fear. It's crippling.
Yeah, well,
why assume the worst all the time? Go ahead.
The danger of the government surveillance is not that they're going to be micromanaging everybody's lives and secretly controlling everything from the shadows, but that by doing so, they're giving fringe groups fuel for the conspiracy fire.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, that's the thing. I mean, it just would be nice if we could have due vigilance without people going into panic mode. Okay. I'm sure some of this went on, say, like at the time of the American Revolution. Okay. Who are the loyalists among us? Who are the ones that support the revolution, and who are the loyalists? I'm sure these American colonists and the revolutionaries were maybe skeptical about some of their neighbors, and were they turning them into the authorities or outing them or whatever? Because some of these meetings had to take place in secret for obvious reasons. So this stuff isn't anything new, but there's a difference between being aware of something in a given context versus extrapolating that context to basically say it's just widespread and it's everywhere. That's where it just starts to get a little cockamamie.
Yeah, I think one of the important things to keep in mind is real conspiracies happen. I mean, the CIA has backed coups all over Latin America in support of the United Fruit Company. The real conspiracy. But for me, the interest in conspiracy comes with what are the hard facts that we know.
Right.
The more speculative it gets, I think, the less useful it is in terms of forming our worldview. However, the more speculative it is, the more useful it is in creating sacrificial victims. So there's the double-edged sword there. Like the more speculative, the more popular it's going to be.
Yes. Well, let me get to these articles. They're pretty, I mean, I only have a few points to make from them. The first one was actually a transcript of an interview that the APA, American Psychological Association, did with Karen Douglas, Dr. Karen Douglas from the University of Kent. She focuses on why people buy into conspiracies and what's the psychology behind it. She basically names three psychological factors at work. And she basically categorizes them this way. First, there's epistemic reasons. Some people buy into conspiracies because they need to feel that they know something, and there are things that they can know and be certain of. And let me kind of interject my own thinking. I couldn't decide if I wanted to say thinking or thought, and so I said think. Well, anyway, think, thank, thunk. Well, she does say, she says, quote, people with lower levels of education tend to be drawn to conspiracy theories. All right, we know that's true. That doesn't mean that everybody believes in conspiracy theory. It doesn't have anything to do with intelligence per se.
Yeah, education is not a good correlative for intelligence.
Right, exactly. There's a difference between the knowledge that a person has, information that a person has stored in his or her brain, versus how we use the information that we have. That's the difference between knowledge and wisdom. Okay? Here's the thing. People that don't know as much as other people want to feel like they know something that other people don't know. Conspiracy theories are often an easy way for somebody to convince themselves, I know the truth. Everybody else out there is blind, but I know what the truth is because I've heard about this, and it's, again, some simple explanation for something that's most likely just a broader cultural phenomenon. But nevertheless, there's the epistemic needs, there are existential needs because people want to feel safe and secure. That goes back to that whole scapegoat thing we were talking about. And then there are social motivations, she says. Everybody wants to feel good about themselves and the groups to which we belong. Well, this is where the internet has made it possible for people who are inclined to buy into things that most people don't buy into, can find each other, and then they can convince each other that they're the only ones that really know the truth. Okay? So how does that hook in with the sociological stuff, Isaac?
Yeah, so the truth-seeking element of it is rather important because the news media has become so... people have become so skeptical of the mainstream media that anything that they read written by anybody that they have not seen for themselves becomes suspect. So, a few years ago during the whole Pizzagate thing, there was a gunman who drove from, I think it was North Carolina to DC to go to the pizza parlor that Pizzagate is all about.
Yes.
When he was talking about his experience, he said that he just went to do fact finding, to see for himself what was going on. That he knew there's some other thing happening here. I can't trust what I'm reading on the message boards. I can't trust the news media. I have to go see it for myself. Unfortunately, the way he chose to do that was to go in there with weapons and shoot a door open to a stockroom. But
I'm sure the pizza was cold by the time he got home with it.
I don't even know if they serve good pizza. But so much of conspiracy theory, like so many of the people involved in conspiracy theories are fact finders for themselves. They will go out and do their own research.
Right.
And it doesn't really matter what they find because they have this confirmation bias that whatever they see is some nefarious plot or scheme. And part of the reason for that is that they form, especially in the internet days, back before the internet, a conspiracy theorist might have been, the fool on the hill shouting nonsense at everybody all by himself, screaming into the void. But nowadays, conspiracy theorists form like little cults around the idea.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so to bring evidence forward that's anything other than additive to the pre-existing belief would oust you from your community. And that's, obviously people have psychological impulses against doing that.
Yeah. And that kind of ties back into some of the other things that Dr. Douglas was saying in that interview. There are certain aspects of this where, like, there's no difference between men and women buying into conspiracy theories. The older people get, the more skeptical they tend to be of conspiracy theories. I think probably the longer people live, the more complex they see things are over time. But one of the common things she talks about is a lot of people that buy into conspiracy theories are narcissistic. Now, when people hear the word narcissistic, they immediately think of arrogance. Well, that's one type of narcissism. But narcissism can come from both poles. The idea is the need to feel like narcissism is an overinflated sense of importance. So on one hand, you have people that already think that they are important. I'm the person that needs to know this or know this because I'm the person that could do something about it. Yada, 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 yada. On the other hand, there are other people that don't feel important but want to feel important, and they become obsessed with wanting to feel important. So this is how it's the same stuff like people joining cults. Go ahead.
Yeah,
I'm sorry.
That whole thing goes back to, this comes out of the impulse for meaning making. Right? It's what makes my life meaningful. How do I fit into the big picture? The self-importance is important to, like, for everybody, not just whack jobs.
Yeah, and these conspiracies tend to, as she points out, they always circle around things that are very large and very significant. Like, people generally don't get into conspiracies. Gee whiz, I wonder why the local supermarket raised corn 3 cents a can or whatever. It must be some kind of conspiracy that they're just trying to make more money so they can have a bigger Christmas party at the end of the year or something, whatever. People don't generally get into that. It's got to be something really big, and because that's what makes it important to everybody else. So this whole obsession with feeling important is tied even to just the nature of what the conspiracies are about. The conspiracies tend to be about important things. And then that's what gives people that buy into them a feeling of importance, because they're somehow getting the inside information or know the real truth, okay, about this important thing. So anyway, I also read an article by Melinda Moyer, and this was published by Scientific American magazine. And she talks about a lot of the same stuff, why people are drawn into conspiracy theories. But she says that, again, people feel alienated or unwanted. There are collective social setbacks. She said the funny thing about conspiracy theories is that people buy into them to try to feel better, but they actually have the opposite effect, and they backfire and make people feel actually worse. And that's why they tend to be addictive. So it's like, if you're suspicious of, if you have a lot of suspicion, okay, well then you try to, satisfy that suspicion by buying into some kind of conspiracy theory. And then that conspiracy theory just gives you more reason to think that you have even more reason to be suspicious. And so people that buy into conspiracy theories big time tend to buy into clusters of conspiracy theories. Is that in the literature for the sociological stuff too?
No, that is an interesting element of this that I had not considered, that conspiracy thinking would kind of be its own Ouroboros of suspicion.
Yeah, it's kind of like a black hole. It's you just keep getting drawn into it, and the more you buy into conspiracy theories, the more skeptical you become, and then that leads to accepting another conspiracy theory, and then the skepticism just keeps building until you end up with these nihilists, essentially, who don't trust anybody or anything except my own particular group. And this is where, okay, we have to, so let's shift maybe now to how do we put on the brakes? Okay, we've already acknowledged that there are conspiracies, and there's a certain rationale for being aware of conspiracies when they happen and being vigilant. But we have to keep ourselves from going to the other extreme and going too far with it. Okay, it's like the person that's they're afraid to drive more than 30 miles an hour. And then whenever they finally get the courage to drive faster than 30, well, then they enjoy going 40 and 50. Well, then they just keep going until they're driving everywhere about 85, 90 miles an hour. Well, then it starts getting dangerous. You get addicted to speed. So at some point you have to kind of keep yourself in check. So what she, Dr. Moyer talks about, or Melinda Moyer, I'm sorry, I don't know. I'm not sure about her credentials. I think she's a PhD, though. I'm not sure. I'll have to back and double check that. But she talks about there are marks of false conspiracy theories. A lot of the ones that turn out to be false, there end up being contradictions. And the funny thing is that people will continue to believe in these theories, even though there are contradictions, and then the confirmation bias kicks in. And that's another part of buying into conspiracies in a heavy way gets to be dangerous. It's like buying into any ideology where somehow it's easier to lie to yourself than it is to admit that, maybe I was wrong, or maybe I jumped the gun on this or went too far. Because it's like the person, it's like the old stereotype of the guy who's driving with the family and he makes a wrong turn and he's lost, but he doesn't want to admit to the rest of the family he's lost. So when they're saying, hey, you made a wrong turn, Dad, you need to go, oh, no, I know where I'm at, and they don't want to admit.
This way's faster.
Right. Yeah, I know a shortcut. Yeah, right. And they don't want to admit that, we're supposed to be heading west. You made a right turn when we were headed north, so you're actually heading us in the wrong direction. But they don't want to admit that. And that's where it starts to get dangerous. When people start buying into stuff where being right matters more to them than actual truth. Okay, or let's put it this way, not admitting you're wrong becomes more important than embracing the truth. That's where it starts to get really harmful and corrosive. Also, false conspiracy theories are based on a lot of shaky assumptions. There's a lot of jumping to conclusions in conspiracy theories, that false conspiracy theories, and then often evidence that's even pointed out against the conspiracy theory gets reinterpreted as somehow proof that it is true.
Well, they planted this evidence, the people who are trying to cover this up. Yes,
exactly right. So, oh my goodness. I don't want to get into the OJ trial, but that was a lot of the whole thing there. But nevertheless, I thought maybe before we to maybe push this towards some kind of a conclusion, not ending it, but I'm just saying what I would like to do is maybe just for a few minutes here before we wrap it up, talk about how can we evaluate conspiracy theories? How can we evaluate when we're getting carried away? All right. So how do we evaluate? So I thought, okay, and you can just comment on this as you want. Just jump in here anywhere. So we always start with what is the phenomenon that we're trying to explain? What is the event? What is the behavior? We're trying to explain behavior. So I don't know if have you ever seen the Hitchcock movie Rear Window?
That's one of my favorite movies.
Oh, yeah. So, Jimmy Stewart's sitting there and he's watching Raymond Burr do all this stuff and out there in his garden. And so he's trying to explain the behavior. All right. Well, it turned out in that case, he was right about Raymond Burr. But all right, we start with what are we trying to explain? Now, here's the thing. You have to make distinctions between observations and suspicions. Okay. Conspiracy theories often get off the ground because people go beyond observations to just allowing their suspicions to run wild. And here's the thing. Our whole court system is based on trying to keep people testifying on the facts, like what did you hear, what did you see, not interpreting that, but allowing that up to the jury to interpret what those observations mean. But if we get to a point in society where we have more and more people that can't observe things and try to refrain from jumping to a conclusion all the time, we're going to have really more difficulty sorting out the truth. And we're at a point in time, especially with AI and other kinds of technology. Just, there was just on the CBS Evening News last night or the night before here about AI and how it's being used to now duplicate people's voices and things. So we're at a point where you're not, we may not even be able to trust half of what we see on the internet because it could be manufactured. But this is where we're going to have to kind of use some of these other, I don't want to say techniques, but keep some of these other principles in mind so that we just don't get crippled in fear, but yet still be cautious because we don't want to get scammed, right? All right. So the second thing, after we're talking about the phenomenon, now, how strong is the evidence? Okay. What is the evidence? How much evidence is there? Okay. That's another thing. Some people see one little thing and then all of a sudden it's widespread. So we find one sex trafficking ring and then we assume, this must be going on everywhere. Okay. And it may be in more than one place. It may be in several places, but you got to be careful again that you investigate, look for facts. Okay. Are there repeated patterns or only singular events? That's another thing. Repeated patterns are a lot more indicative of what's going on than are individual events. I mean, anybody that's raised kids knows this. There could be a number of reasons why your kids do certain things. You have to pay attention to individual things, but you can't get panicky over every single thing that your kid may or may not do, your child. You need to pay attention to behaviors and patterns in their thinking, patterns in their actions and their speech and other things. And then we have to ask ourselves, how objectively is the evidence being viewed? I mean, bring in a friend or so and such and say, what do you think about this? Do you think there's anything to this? At some point, folks, we have to keep each other in balance. Because here's the thing. This is the next step. You have to ask yourself, what stake does each person have in this? Okay? So what is the motivation? What's the motivation for the people that are supposedly involved in the conspiracy? What's the motivation for people that aren't involved? What's the motivation for the people who are reporting the conspiracy, just like you pointed out? I mean, I guess it would be easier to take Alex Jones seriously if he wasn't uber wealthy from spreading this kind of belief. But it's, again, let's put it this way. You go propagating conspiracy theories. I mean, you make yourself susceptible to being accused of being a part of one.
Well, that's exactly what has happened to Alex Jones, that he's actually some sort of crisis actor or something trying to destabilize the conspiracy community. Which is hilarious to me.
Yeah, it's kind of like...
It's a self-cannibalizing type of community.
Well, this is what, say, George Edward Moore, who taught at Cambridge, was a contemporary of Bertrand Russell at the turn of the 20th century, early 20th century. He argued that skepticism in general, when it becomes excessive, it basically leads to nihilism, and that's that whole downward spiral. It's so, like, philosophers got into this whole thing about, starting with Descartes. How do I know that I'm not imagining the world and all of my life is just a dream or whatever? Well, David Hume pointed out, if you go buying into that and say, I don't know if that tree's really there, well, then try walking through it or whatever and see what happens. And at the end of the day, we have to like trust there have to be a certain amount of basic trust, like trusting my senses, trusting my sanity. Okay. Because otherwise you can't function. And that's what's so sad about seeing people that have, dementia, Alzheimer's and other kinds of dementia, because they basically lose that fabric, and then the confusion, I would imagine, would be overwhelming.
Yeah, I think honestly it would be a good idea to maybe spend a whole episode just doing epistemology.
Maybe so. I mean, my grandfather died with Alzheimer's, and he managed to live to be 92, 93 even then, but it was just really something how, like, he just kind of even gradually lost most of his identity as time went on. He just kind of started becoming like a more generic person.
My mama died with dementia in her mid-80s, and it was one of those situations where she had been gone for so long that the goodbye process took years, but it started before she died. And there were little glimpses of like, that sort of thing. It's similar with Alzheimer's, I know. So
yeah, we can bring that in, because I thought about maybe we would do an episode just on truth and why it's important and how do we know it. And we could even discuss this a little more philosophically, and then kind of bring it around to what's the practical relevance of all these different kinds of theories and such. And
yeah, we could start talking about dialectics.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. And so we'll put that on the agenda.
Circle back into Conspiracy Town.
Yes.
Just kind of to add to your point, you mentioned that there's an ideological element to this, and this is another rich vein of topics that we could talk about. We might do a whole episode on just what is ideology. But I think really a conspiracy theory is an ideological tool, and it kind of masks over the real enemy, which is ideology itself. Because for me anyway, my understanding of ideology, and I could be wrong, is that an ideology is any set of beliefs or ideals that support their own perpetuity, that resist change in any way.
Yes. So here would be, and maybe we would define ideology a little different. I would just call an ideology just like a particular perspective or way of, like, a worldview, maybe perhaps would be another way of saying it. The corrosive part that you're talking about has to do with one's emotional attachment to embracing an ideology, because then that becomes self-authenticating. And that's the difference between, say, somebody kind of liking a particular idea. An ideology tends to be a whole worked out system.
Right.
And once somebody, that tends to be coherent within itself, but then it closes itself off to any other kinds of interpretations. And once somebody becomes like emotionally attached to that, like, for example, it might be one thing to say, oh, I can read stuff by Buddhist thinkers, and I can look at Buddhism and say, oh, there's certain aspects of it that I find appealing or whatever. But if there's a difference, or let's just say even somebody who's was Buddhist and say, well, I can read the teachings of Jesus and I understand Christianity. But once somebody embraces that as their way of thinking, then it's very possible, and often people will use a particular worldview to basically try to explain away everything else that doesn't fit the model.
Yeah, well, and to me, the danger is when something claims to be universally true.
Yeah.
there's no exit. There's no open-mindedness anymore. You've closed it off. Oh, well, this is what the meaning of the universe is, and therefore, yada, yada, yada. Anything that challenges that is a threat. And that's the danger of ideology. And I think conspiracy theories are sort of a front for ideological values.
Yes, yes. Now, for you listeners here talk, and you hear me say, okay, Isaac suggesting we go ahead and do an episode on epistemology. Don't worry, it won't be something that's going to be over most people's heads or anything like that. We won't get into too much technical stuff, but we do want to kind of talk about different ways that people view knowledge and what's reliable. So, like, just as a quick teaser here for you, let's just say the difference between what you observe with your senses and somebody saying, I just have this hunch or whatever. I have this intuition that something's going to happen or whatever. Even like talking about those kind of things and the different kinds of ideas. One of the things that when we're talking about this, I don't know if it depends on how much we have time for, whether we have to do this in a separate episode or be able to include it. At some point, I want to talk about paradigm shifts and Thomas Kuhn's.
Yeah, let's get into the structure of scientific revolutions.
Yes, because that
great
is
resource.
Absolutely that because that gets into the whole sociological part of the quest for truth, but then the temptation for the acquisition of truth to be self-serving. Okay. And so anyway, we talk about objectivity versus subjectivity. Truthfully, I think at the end of the day, when we're if you're evaluating a conspiracy, I still come back to something like Occam's razor. Occam's razor, again, for those of you who haven't heard it before, William of Ockham basically argued that when you're evaluating something, you have choices. You have choices of different ways of explaining things. This is the same way. This was the starting point of a lot of certain aspects of Charles Saunders Peirce's pragmatism. You have certain explanations. Peirce called this abduction. We have different explanations, and then you reason to the best explanation. Now, what Occam says back in the medieval period, the simplest adequate explanation is most likely the correct one. So it has to be adequate on one side. I think I've talked about this already a little bit earlier, so I don't want to repeat myself. I seem to remember talking about it.
Yeah, there's no harm in repetition.
Well, anyway, on one hand, an explanation that's too simple doesn't account for all the evidence. Okay, so like the people that whenever there's something that contradicts what they think, that they just kind of dismiss that out of hand. Fake news, right? So just throw it out because it doesn't fit my paradigm. Okay, that's not an adequate explanation. An adequate explanation has to account for everything. On the other hand, the simplest adequate explanation. Why do explanations start to get overly complicated? Because they're trying to explain away evidence that doesn't fit. See? And they're trying to reinterpret stuff. Well, the reason that is, and we alluded to that before. It's like, the Earth's only 6,000 years old. Well, what about all these fossils and everything? Well, God put them in there, or, the flood caused that. And it's just a convoluted explanation.
Yeah, you're touching on what I think is like the easiest way for me to explain what simple means is in terms of amount of assumption you're making. So
that's pretty good. Yeah.
The most adequate explanation with the fewest amount of assumption being made. So if you have to assume that God is out to trick certain people that have not had the truth revealed to them, that's a pretty huge assumption rather than the assumptions of, say, like a physical explanation for how the fossils got there.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. We keep talking about assumptions. Do you ever watch The Odd Couple, the old TV show?
I'm not familiar with it.
Oh, yeah. You need to go back and watch the episode where they're in court and Felix and Oscar got arrested for ticket scalping, but Felix was just trying to give the tickets away or sell them for what he paid for them. And they got arrested. Well, this lady said, did I ask you for more money? She says, no, I just assumed. Well, then he goes over to the blackboard. You should never assume because you make out of you and me, and the judge thought that was hilarious.
I know that joke.
But I always think of that whenever we talk about assuming things. But nevertheless, here's the thing: you don't want an explanation that's too simple, and you don't want an explanation that's overly complicated either, in the sense that it's trying to explain away things. You have to allow the facts to speak for themselves and not jump to conclusions. But if you don't have enough evidence, then get more evidence. And just quit allowing our fears to kick in. Now, here's the thing. Ask yourself, okay, what does everybody have at stake here? And just like I said, okay, government's listening. Well, what would be the motivation? Let's say some dude working for the FBI or some lady working for the CIA. I mean, are they now, if I'm out there now that I've got a podcast, who knows, maybe I'll be on somebody's list. I don't know. But, in most of my life, I think my life is probably pretty boring and people in the government don't really care to know what I'm doing because it really doesn't matter to them. If I'm doing something that's going to affect somebody's safety or somebody's pocketbook, then somebody will start paying attention. I mean, and that just makes sense. Okay. That's why I've told my father and other, some of my older relatives, I don't think any of us are doing anything that somebody that's working for the government really cares about what we're doing. Okay. Really. They don't. If we're out there organizing riots or whatever, then yeah, they're going to be watching us. Okay. But that's the thing. What's everybody got in stake here? Apply Occam's razor. Think about what's everybody's motive, even the people that are buying into conspiracy theories or the people that just dismiss them out of hand. Okay. Those are the opposite extremes. Okay. What are their motivations? Okay. And think about that. And finally, the last thing I would throw out here in terms of evaluating and principles for evaluating them has to do with checks and balances. I've talked about this so much, but what makes society stable is checks and balances. That's why I think the framers of our Constitution tried to put checks and balances in. That's part of the problem. We have parts of our government that don't have enough checks and balances. And then you end up with people, say like Supreme Court, who, once they get in, I mean, they don't have any accountability to anybody. And that can happen on both sides. Okay. There's all kinds of judicial activism, but it can't be avoided to some extent because they have to make rulings and decisions. But there need to be checks and balances. Whenever you hear a conspiracy theory, then ask yourself this. What would be the checks and balances? Like, what would it take for a conspiracy like this to really be successful? So let's say, for instance, somebody's saying, they're coming up with vaccines, these vaccines for COVID. COVID vaccines are just intended so they can gain control of us by inserting chips. Well, think about all the people that could benefit from spilling that information. Let's say somebody were really trying to do that. Now, how could they get away with that? And what would be the motivation for all the other people to go along with it? Now, there are times, say, like, okay, well, here's the thing. Like Nazi Germany, this is why Hitler had so many different, created so many different organizations to keep each other in check. So he had the SS, and then he had the Gestapo, and the Luftwaffe, and, you had all these different groups, and then they were all like spying on each other because Hitler knew that people were going to they were going to try to get at him. And so I'm sure Putin and other people do the same exact thing. You have people watching each other to keep each other in check. As long as the checks and balances are in place, that's what really protects us. If everybody starts buying into the same ideology, that's whenever it starts to get dangerous.
Yeah, this is part of that. How could they possibly get away with this? Most real conspiracies, the people perpetrating them thought they were doing the right thing. They would have had no reason to have like moral quandaries over what they were doing because they were on the side of justice or something like that. Whereas these like really crazy conspiracy theories of like, oh, they're sacrificing children in the woods. That's just straight up evil. Like, you can't convince yourself in any form that that's a good thing to do. So how could they do it?
I mean, it's one thing to say, oh, it could never happen. Well, yeah, it could happen. But the question that somehow it becomes systemic and that everybody's turning a blind eye to it.
Right. That it's the deep state or something like that.
Yeah. See that? I'm sorry. That's just deep paranoia is really what a lot of that is. And, oh my goodness. I mean, get out there and get involved. Get involved in the political campaigns and such. Start spending time at the headquarters. Find out what people, how they think and what makes them tick and all that. Oh my goodness. But the checks and balances are there. I'm not worried about, personally, about the vaccines or whatever. I mean, it's just like people say, oh, the scientists have a conspiracy. I was a scientist early in my career, and I know that if some scientists try to start some kind of a conspiracy, there are other scientists out there that will basically make their careers on busting that up. And that's why I trust the scientific community. I don't trust the scientific community because, I've seen that every person in it has been put through a lie detector test. I mean, there are people that falsify experiments and reports, and a lot of these folks have been caught. Okay. There have been scientists who have falsified their data, but they were eventually caught.
I mean, we've talked about the anti-vax movement before, but that's how that started. I mean, there was one, I think he was a UK doctor or something, who published a paper about the link between the MMR vaccine and autism. And he was, he had his credentials removed, but he still does research on the link between the MMR vaccine and autism in Texas to this day. And he has a loyal following of concerned parents, and there's even some celebrities who endorse him and his ideas, even though the scientific community has completely disproven everything he's ever said.
Yeah.
However, he's been able to transform this one dumb research paper he published into an ideology.
Yeah. I think about the example of, like the sexual abuse perpetrated by certain Catholic priests. Well, then it starts to look like a conspiracy whenever the church tries to ignore it because it doesn't want the bad publicity. And this is why it's important for everybody on the other side to be vigilant. And when you see something going on that doesn't look right, don't try to cover it up.
Blow the whistle.
Deal with it head on. Exactly right. I really don't think there's again, people could say, oh, the Catholic Church is a secretly a sex trafficking ring and, whatever. I mean, there would be another conspiracy. There have been all these people come forward and said, I was molested, this and that. But again, if you put this stuff in proper perspective, okay, and use Occam's razor and say, what's the most likely explanation? All right, well, You had a bunch of guys who took vows of celibacy, and they just couldn't restrain themselves, and they took out their frustrations on the most vulnerable, which were the altar boys. And instead of the church doing something about it, the church is Roman Catholic Church still wants to view itself as the only true Christian church, et cetera, et cetera. So it was just very short-sighted of it for them to try to cover up this stuff instead of and besides, the church also had this history of not having the answer to the state. So if you confess something to the priest didn't have to report it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That's all changed in my lifetime too. I remember in the 80s and 90s, they had a couple episodes like on Law and Order about that particular issue, about somebody confessing to a priest about some crime that had been committed. It started where, like, if somebody confessed that they were thinking of committing a crime, that they had to report that. They didn't originally have to report that. That was part of religious freedom and all that in the United States. You go confess to your priest, I've been having these thoughts of, killing my next door neighbor or killing my wife and kids. And then the priest couldn't say anything to the authorities or wasn't supposed to. But that changed. But, when you're evaluating stuff, again, don't let your fears run away. Put things into proper perspective. And part of that is not just gathering evidence, about what happened, but gather evidence about the context in which it happened. That's another part of it as well. If somebody understands the history of the Catholic Church, then it starts to make more sense of what most likely actually happened. That it wasn't some conspiracy, whatever. It was just a pattern of behavior that goes all the way back to the Middle Ages, of covering things up and the church not being accountable to anybody. And we finally reached a point in time where, at least in the United States, that will blow up in your face at some point. And it did. So anyway, that's where it's at. I'm going to say one last thing here before we wrap things up here, Isaac. I cannot help but think, and I don't want to get into a lot of this because maybe we'll just do an episode on this. But the question I have always had, why do Americans tend to buy into this stuff, say more, or seem to say more than Europeans and, other of the other industrialized nations of the world? I don't want to say everything is due to religion, but in this case, I think that the pervasive influence of Reformed Protestant theology has kind of tainted American culture. And I say it this way. Why? Because of two basic doctrines, like the doctrine of total depravity and the doctrine of predestination. Americans have, because of this Protestant influence for a couple centuries, have bought into this notion that the average person is completely selfish, can't be trusted. I've heard students say that they don't think that, for example, atheists can truly love people. Their love isn't real love, it's selfish love. I'm like, based on what? And it's not based on anything else than an assumption based on some kind of a doctrine, which is only one way of interpreting the scriptures. Okay? See, the Protestant Reformation was not just about rebelling against the abuses of power in the Catholic Church, but they also thought that the church had become too liberal, which is what was going on in what they call Renaissance humanism, that the pervasiveness of sin has not really corrupted people to a great extent. We're all selfish and we're all sinful to some degree, but there's still some good in everybody. There's still some part of the image of God left in the average person. Well, the Protestant reformers, Luther, Calvin, a lot of them, denied that, and they went back to the theology of St. Augustine from the 5th and early 6th century and said, no, we're completely depraved. You can't trust people. John Calvin said that even babies are seed beds of all kinds of iniquity. I doubt that he ever got asked to serve in the nursery at church, but nevertheless, but
John, we left you in the nursery for 5 minutes. Why is that baby burning at the stake?
I mean, my goodness, like we used to sing this one chorus before Sunday school when I was growing up, and it starts out, smile, God loves you, put your hand in the hand of the Lord, and then the last line of the whole song is, smile, God loves you, and heaven knows he never should. It's like, where did that come from? And I'm like, really? I'm inherently unlovable? And why people have bought into that notion that somehow everybody is so sinful that people can't be trusted. I think that feeds into all this conspiracy stuff that Americans tend to go crazy with. The other part is the doctrine of predestination, or God's absolute sovereignty, that everything that happens is because it's part of God's will. Like, things just don't happen coincidentally. And in fact, John Calvin specifically said that coincidence and chance are pagan concepts. They're not Christian concepts. I've heard Calvinists of different stripes say that there is no such thing as chance for the Christian, even though the Bible says time and chance, and it rains on the just and the unjust. Time and chance happens to everybody. But no. Everything happens for a purpose. So you got all these folks out here that have been conditioned to think you can't trust people. Okay? You can't even trust yourself, for Pete's sake. You can't trust your own thinking. You can't trust your conscience. You can't trust your own judgment. And then, if it happens, it must be happening for a reason. Well, if God's not directly causing it, somebody else must be. This bad thing happened, we're right back to the scapegoat stuff. And you can see where this is very medieval, I should say primitive type thinking. Because again, we're oversimplifying human emotions and human motivations.
Yeah, I'm drawn to think about the prevalence of spiritual warfare type language that I have experienced in various churches, where anything bad that happens is attributed to the devil. And
the devil made me do it.
I kind of think it's the ultimate conspiracy theory that there is some, like negative spiritual power that's constantly waging war against the Almighty God. Like, even though that is internally nonsense. If you have an all-powerful God, there's nothing that,
right,
that doesn't make any sense. But those beliefs often coexist.
Right.
God's in control of everything, but somehow Satan still manages to corrupt the world.
Yes.
Which is, to me, that's the ultimate conspiracy, that everything that goes wrong because Satan caused it to.
See, and I'll say that much for John Calvin. At least he was consistent. So the people that are evil, that's just part of God's plan too, because it somehow brings glory to God just to create people to punish evil. So anyway, I don't want to get into that, but that I'm just kind of doing a teaser here because I really think the American mindset is largely shaped by this kind of thinking, and it's time that it be put back into its medieval context. There are all kinds of other options out there for the Christians in America. I mean, especially like the whole Arminian sector. With prevenient grace. John Wesley was a big believer in Arminius's doctrine of prevenient grace. But nevertheless, we don't have to view the world as, everybody, nobody can be trusted, and everything, the whole world's going to hell in a handbasket. And then the people that are, again, looking for Jesus to come back any minute. I mean, that's a nice thought, but the people that are so obsessed with that, they actually want things to get worse so that Jesus can come back sooner. At least they've been conditioned to think that that's what's going to happen. And this kind of stuff we've got to start putting some of this stuff into perspective. I mean, this might have been kind of interesting and cute when it was a bunch of people in the 19th century frontier propagating these ideas by horseback or Pony Express or whatever. But now stakes are much higher. And if people don't learn how to sort this stuff out for themselves, we're giving too much power to people that should not have that much power. It saddens me that somebody like an Alex Jones can get that big of an audience, to be honest with you.
To circle back real quick, there's an interesting sociological element to Protestant theology. I mean, I think some people would be aware of, there's a rather famous book called The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Capitalism.
Max Weber.
Yeah. Was that Weber or Durkheim? I don't remember, and it's not really relevant. But
no, that was Weber, the Protestant
Weber?
work ethic. Yeah, because everybody wanted to prove they were one of the elect. Go ahead.
So one of the strong indicators for vulnerability to conspiratorial thinking is economic inequality, level of poverty, and that is a direct result of American-style capitalism. The amount of income inequality and wealth inequality we have in this country is greater than it's ever been.
Mm-hmm.
It's gotten out of hand, out of control.
Right.
And that, I think, correlates pretty strongly with the decline of American communities and the rise of conspiratorial thinking, which is largely, I think it's true that Protestant view of, or Reformed view of humanity as evil keeps people from thinking that they deserve any better.
Right. Because even Martin Luther bought into the notion that everybody's born into kind of a certain, it's almost like a Christian caste system.
Yeah, exactly.
Like you fit, this is where, you're supposed to bloom where you're planted. God planted you here in this garden. Don't try to change yourself or your destiny. That's backwards thinking, and it needs to be combated. Well, that's something that we'll have to come back to. But my Illuminati bosses have just signaled me and told me it's time for us to quit. We protected them anyway. I won't tell you who my Illuminati bosses are, but it's just a little tongue in cheek here. But anyway, was there anything else you wanted to add here before we wrap it up, Isaac?
Yeah, one last quick point about Occam's razor. We talked in our first episode about equipping people with the tools to think for themselves.
Yes.
Occam's razor is the hammer in your toolbox. I mean, it's of utmost importance. And what I, as a student, when I was, in your classes, had a hard time grasping it until I really started putting it to use. Like, I understood it technically, but then I started using it and I was like, oh, this has a lot more implications than I really understood. So I'd like to come back to Occam's razor and keep touching on that as we start producing more episodes here.
Absolutely. That certainly will come into play with our epistemology episode and truth, whenever we decide to do that. But we'll be doing that pretty soon. We also, on the docket, a couple of these recent court rulings kind of caught our attention, and we're musing over those and getting our thoughts and getting those organized and getting ready to tackle that. But for now, we're going to sign off, and it's been great spending this hour or so with you. We hope you all take care. Keep safe, and again, keep everything in perspective, and have a great day. All
Yeah,
right?
remember to I'll do the little
give her a pitch
housekeeping here. Remember to like, rate, subscribe, do whatever your podcatcher lets you do. Ratings are especially helpful. If you want to ask us a question through the rating system on Apple Podcasts or whatever you're using, we'll see that. We'll respond. You can also reach us at thehappycynics@gmail.com for any episode suggestions or requests or questions you might have.
Awesome. Well, that's it. And we appreciate your time. And you take care, and we'll see you really soon.
Thanks for listening.